Wouldn't it be cool to speak like a Roman? Well, to do that, you need to know how to pronounce text like this. As far as languages go, Latin is pretty straightforward to pronounce. Words nearly always sound how they are written, and every syllable is pronounced. So unlike English where there are a lot of silent letters, Latin is not like this. However, if you want to be able to speak Latin well, it takes a lot of practice to master these sounds. And depending on what your native language is, some of these sounds may be a little bit more difficult. Generally speaking, there are two ways to pronounce Latin, either the classical pronunciation or the ecclesiastical pronunciation. The classical pronunciation is the reconstructed pronunciation. This is how linguists figure the Romans actually spoke. Ecclesiastical pronunciation, on the other hand, is the pronunciation used by the Catholic Church. In this video, however, we will mainly be focusing on the classical pronunciation. First, I would like to examine some elements of the pronunciation, such as the alphabet. Then I would like to read an actual text so that you can get an idea of everything in context. So if you were up for the challenge, stick with me as I show you how to pronounce Latin. If you like this content, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. That will help me out tremendously. The original Latin alphabet had 23 letters, A through Z, however there was no J, W, or U. It is important to note that the V actually makes the W sound as in water, and it also makes the U sound as in moon. The letter U did not actually used to exist in Latin, so eventually the letter U was invented to differentiate the W sound from the U sound, because originally it was written with the V for the vowel and V for the consonant sound. For example, sometimes you would see the word lingua latina. It looks like lingua latina, but it's said like lingua latina. So in Latin, you would say Victoria, or the words by Julius Caesar, Veni Vidi Vici. There was not originally a J in Latin, but there is a place where you would see J's written now. For example, Jesus or Yam. These two words actually don't have the J sound. They make the sound of a Y as in Y, but the J was later invented to cover this sound. Instead of a J, you would see IA or IE, as in Yuxta. All of these words, they don't have a J, but it's the IA or IE, and this is where the J sound would be in English. Now, the C in Latin is always hard as in cat. However, here's the kicker. You don't actually say that puff of air behind it. Us English speakers have a lot of breath behind our words, so when we say cat, it's k. But if you wanted to say words like Caesar, it's not Caesar, it's Caesar. Caesar, or at least that is my best attempt. It is a very dry sound. It doesn't have all that wind behind it. But the main thing to remember is that it is always a hard C. Now, the G in Latin is also always hard, as in Gallia. It is also hard in the middle of a word. For example, angelus or angulus. The G is always hard. For another example, you'd have words like pugnatio. It is a little bit softer, but it is still that G sound. It's almost like G in hangnail. Now, there's also a PH in Latin. PH is basically said like an English P. You don't say philosophia. You could say that, but it's better to say philosophia. In original classical Latin, the PH was said like P in English. There is a P in Latin, and it is said like the English P. However, it doesn't have that big puff of air like you would hear in English. If you wanted to say pater, it's not pater, it's pater. It's almost between the B and the P sound. It's not a big puff of air behind it. We need to remember the R's are rolled in Latin, and especially on the first syllable. It is just like Spanish, where you would say R in the beginning. For example, Romani ite domum. If you know, you know. This sound can be hard for English speakers, but with some practice, you can also develop this sound. If you say the word butter in English, this puts your tongue in the right position to be able to roll the R the proper way. If you put your tongue up on the top of your mouth like this, and then you blow out, it becomes a rolled R like this. Obviously, it's easier said than done. However, with some practice, you too can develop this sound. Now, the QU in Latin. QU is basically just like the QU in English. Qua, as in quid, quis. Now the T. There is a T in Latin, and it's said similarly to the English T. However, as I've said before about the other letters, there's not a big puff of air behind it, not as much of a T. For example, Marcus Tullius Cicero. It's not a big T behind it. The S in Latin is slightly different from that in English. The S in English, we tend to say S up here as in sin. In Latin, it actually has more of a retracted S, which you put your tongue farther back in your mouth, as in Julius. It's not Julius. It's not way up here. You put your tongue farther back in your mouth. It's almost between the S sound and the sh sound. It has that softer sound. Sh. Now we've come to the vowels. We need to remember that there are long and short vowels. These vowel lengths are indicated by macrons, which are lines above the words. Keep in mind that you will not always see these macrons. Sometimes in literature, you won't see these lines. However, as you read more Latin, especially graded readers that have these lines, you will eventually learn which words have long and short vowels. The thing to remember about Latin vowels is they have a very specific sound and they always stay the same. For example, let's start with A. You could say that it is like the A in father. However, this is actually a little bit of a misunderstanding. The A sound in Latin is a little bit different from that. It's not ah as in father, it's ah. So when you say the Latin A, it's more like ah as in pater. For the short A, it's femina, and for the long A, it's femina. The E in Latin makes the sound like hey, like a, except you don't change the shape of your mouth. You don't say a for short and a for long. So for example, for a short E, it would be ecce. For a long E, it would be venit or me, like me amas. It's not may. You don't say may. It's a nice, clear, steady sound. Now the I. The I in Latin is said somewhat like a long E in English. It's important to always keep the same sound. For example, inimicus or feet. You don't say fit. The sound I does not exist in Latin. So when you see an I, it's either going to be E or E. And then there is also a double I in Latin. This is where, for example, in the word gladii, this is the plural for gladius, a sword. You don't say gladii. You don't really make a space between those words. You don't separate those two I's. You say gladii. There's a little bit of that, but they flow together. So it's gladii. Now the O. The O is similar to the long O in English. However, it does not have that rounded out sound. When you say O, it is simply O. You say oppidum for the short O, or ego for the long O, or pugnatio, that is a fight. Now the letter U. So for the short U, it's U as in sicut or apud. And for the long U, you have manus or senatus. It's like when you stub your toe. Ooh. Now Y. This can either be short or long. The short Y is lycaeum, and the long Y is pyramus. Now we've come to the diphthongs. Diphthongs are when two different vowels are joined together in a word. For example, Caesar or aedificium. AE makes the I sound, similar to I in English, but it's a little bit different. And now the AU as in autem or auris, which means ear. Now OE, foidus, this can mean ugly or it can also mean a covenant. It's a different word, but the same spelling. Now EU, as in seutonius, the way these diphthongs work is one just flows nicely into the other. Now UI, as in fuit, he was, or fui, I was. So it's ui. Now the final M sometimes is omitted when you are reading literature and especially getting the prose of the Latin. For example, if you see tantum est, it becomes tantumst. This is just how the language flows when you're actually speaking it at speed. Now let's read a short passage by Caesar. Gallia stomnis divisa in partes tres, quarum unam inculunt Belgae, aliam Aquitani, tertiam qui ipsorum lingua Celtae, nostra Gallia appellantur. Hi omnes lingua institutis legibus inter se differunt. Gallios ab Aquitanis gerumna flumen a Belgis matrona et sequana dividit. So as you can see, that is how the language sounds all put together. I know that's not a lot, but you get the idea. Remember, when you come to a vowel or a diphthong, say these sounds the way that I have shown you, and your Latin will be so much better. Also, I wanted to give a huge shout out to Luke Ranieri from Polymathy and Scorpio Martianus. He has helped me so much in my Latin pronunciation. I would really recommend that you go check out his channels. I will link those in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out my video that I did on Latin nouns. You can check that video in the description.